Hello, it's Gil Johnson, your Prevost motorhome consultant. Today we're going to talk about the fan clutch replacement. In this case, we call it 2-speed electric fan clutch. Manufacturer actually calls it a 3-speed fan clutch. We're going to go through why we replaced it and the process of doing so. Our fan clutch resides right back here between the fan and the fan belt. We'll go into that in a little bit more depth. I don't know if you can hear this, but I'll spin it and you can see what it sounds like. It shouldn't make any noise at all. Now, hey, you could probably run it on that for a while, but I will tell you that if you ever had a detailed mechanical inspection done at Prevost, they would red flag that as a clutch that needs to be replaced. All right, let's take a look at the major components of the Linnig 3-speed fan clutch. They're illustrated, you'll see all of them, but let's look at them in a little bit more detail. So on the far right of that illustration, you'll show the Prevost parts. Here we have Prevost's serpentine pulley and the mounting adapter that goes between the clutch and the support assembly for the clutch. When you take this off, there's a couple things you want to do. One of them is you want to make sure you understand which one of those elongated slots has the carriage bolts that attach this bracket between the Prevost support assembly and the clutch. If you use the wrong slots, you will not have the fan centered in the fan shroud. And the other thing that you want to do is to make sure before you disassemble this that you take a Sharpie marker or some other marking device and put a horizontal line between the mounting plate and the support bracket. Here you can see illustrated that mark that shows the alignment, the horizontal alignment. This will certainly help you out when you go to reassemble this to make sure that the fan remains center in the fan shroud. This is the Kendrion Linnig 3-speed electromagnetic clutch. This is the core of the entire clutch. And that double bearing you'll see here depicted at the end of that yellow arrow. This is typically what's going to fail. This is what was making that noise that we heard earlier. This is not a go to your store and pick it up kind of bearing. It's a German-made product, double bearing, and on that center piece of it, it actually is tapped to support the outer mechanism that actually locks this clutch. So in my research trying to find one of these bearings, I could only find it available in 2 locations, Poland and Russia. So in my case, I actually opted to get a remanufactured clutch. And then the blue arrows, they're going to show us the locking tab, and yours may not look like this, but in this particular case, a locking tab, the mating bolt holes that you'll see there on the hub, and then the locking bolts that will be used if you ever have an electrical failure. And that's, in this case, it's 2 6mm bolts that actually are retained on the end of the clutch. The next thing we're going to see here is the coil packs. There's 2 coil packs in this, one for a low speed and one for high speed. So anyway, that's where the clutch packs are. And then on the very end, that's where the pulley is going to mount to. The items closest to the radiator that are put on after the fan, when this is assembled, or the first things that come off on disassembly, is that there on the right-hand side is a plate that has a bunch of earth magnets. That's held on with 3 bolts with lock washers. And then the piece on the far outside that has some cooling fans on it, that's a frictionless plate that'll actually, through those coils, allow that fan to spin, or on one of the coils will actually allow it to lock to that magnetic plate. That's put on with either 3 nuts and studs or 3 bolts. Of course, if you order this from Prevost, it's going to come correctly, and that will be nuts and studs. To try to put this on with the bolts would be impossible because there would be no way to line that up when you're assembling this. So make sure that if you do get a rebuilt, that it has the studs and nuts, not the bolts. This is what it looks like when we're getting ready to put this back in. Which obviously it would have been the opposite way when we took it apart. But our charge air cooler pipe has been removed. Our air filter pipe has been removed. All of those openings have been covered. And you can see those with the red arrows pointing up where it actually duct taped the charge air cooler and the turbo inlets. You don't have to do it, but why not? And then you want to make sure that you protect the radiator because you're going to set the fan on the radiator. So you can do that with stiff cardboard, in this case a thin piece of plywood. And you'll also have to, or you should, put a ratchet strap in there because this, when you're taking it out or putting it back in, it's kind of heavy. So that's the first part of our preparation work, to put this back in. Another look at this, you'll see that we have removed the airbag support that was bolted to the motor. And all you have to do is take the 3 bolts out that attach it to the motor, and you can just let it swing or rest in place. I physically removed it because I was painting the engine at the same time. And then you'll want to take a strap, and you can see that strap depicted by that lowest arrow, and you want to force the entire support assembly off to the right hand side to give you maximum room to work putting the clutch on and off in the fan assembly. And I put a strap on it just to make sure that it doesn't inadvertently swing over towards the radiator. And here you can see the ratchet strap sitting there. That's the black and red stripe strap ready for assembly. And what holds that up is actually I've got a board that's sitting on top of the radiator, and then over on top of the valve cover you'll see that small piece of wood depicted with the arrow on the upper right hand side, just to keep the piece of wood up off of that radiator line. You probably don't have to do that, but kind of why not, right? If you didn't mark your alignment on the support bracket and the attachment plate, you want to make sure that you do that now before you put it together. So at this point, everything is ready to put the fan clutch back into place. So as I said earlier, this thing is heavy. It's 50 pounds. Although you can lift it up and put it over the support bracket, trying to get everything aligned, it's just so much easier to use a ratchet strap and do that. So when you put that strap on there, you want to try to avoid putting the strap across the locking tabs, only from the standpoint if the tabs actually get bent inward, they may drag a little bit and maybe a little difficult to pull those back off. So just avoid doing that. You'll also want to make sure that the coil wiring is protected. When you're putting that in there and aligning it, make sure that that coil wiring does not get pinched on anything. It's as simple as actually taking the ratchet straps and moving the assembly up to align with where those horizontal alignment lines were put on prior to removing the clutch. At this point, we've already put the 4 carriage bolts in place after we've aligned those tabs. And those 4 carriage bolts are there, and now we're going to take the fan and set it back on top of the clutch assembly and then put those nuts on. At this point, don't remove the radiator protection because we still have 2 other pieces to put on, but this might be a good time to make sure that you did use the correct 2 elongated slots rather than the other 2. So if you like, you could actually take the strap off that's holding the support assembly off to the right and loosen that up and make sure that the fan goes into the shroud and doesn't hit it. You don't have to do it at this point, but if you've made a mistake on the 4 elongated bolts, this is the time to know that. So we've got the fan all bolted down to the assembly. That's all pretty easy to do. And the next thing is that we'll put those 2 other pieces that we showed earlier. The plate that has the earth magnets in it will be bolted down with its 3 bolts, and then you'll insert the studs so that you've got a way to align that final piece and just slide it over the studs. Once it's over the studs, it'll lock into that magnetic plate, and then tighten those 3 nuts down, and you're done. So now at this point, we'll want to make sure that we have the fan belts in place before we do anything else, because we want to make sure that we're not going to damage the radiator. So we got the fan belts on. We've reattached the assembly that has the airbag on it for tensioning. We'll go into this on a different video, but you'll want to make sure that that support bracket, the airbag support, are all aligned to specifications. But right now, assuming you didn't remove anything other than the 3 bolts holding it onto the engine, you should be able to put it right back. If you did not put that horizontal line to show you where that fan should be, and while you're checking the fan, you want to make sure that the fan is centered in that shroud. Don't assume the length of all of those blades are the same. They, in my case, were not. They varied by up to 1/4 of an inch. So when you're doing your checks, and I just use a micrometer to go in there and check the far right, far left, far up, far down, and make sure that they're all relatively the same. Do that with the same fan blade. Okay, the next thing to do is some testing. Now that we've got the assembly on there with the belts on, the bag adjustment assembly in place, we have now physically tried to push the fan support assembly as far as we can to the left to try to push the fan into the radiator, making sure that at this point there's no way that that fan can hit the radiator. Once we've done that, it's time to air the system up, start the engine, and make sure this works. Before we start the engine, the next thing we want to do is to make sure the fan clutch physically works. We've got the wires in place, we've put all the restraints on, we're ready to test this. So we'll turn the ignition on. We will not start the engine. We'll turn the ignition on, and then we'll use a test relay, which are all we do making a test relay is to take an old relay. It doesn't have to be 24 volts. A 12 volt one will be fine because the voltage sensitive part of this we're going to remove. And the two drawings there on the bottom shows electrically and physically what that fan clutch relay looks like. And all you're going to want to do is break off the 2 tabs, 85 and 86, which would have energized the coil. Breaking those off is simple with a pair of pliers or needle nose, anything like that. And the 2 that you're going to break off, like I said, they're numbered 85 and 86. But if for some reason you can't read the numbering on the bottom, it's the 2 outer ones that are parallel to each other. So with the ignition on and the relay in the low speed, speed 1 slot, you should feel some resistance when you're holding the pulley that the fan belt is on and turning the fan itself. You should notice some resistance when you're in the low speed, speed 1 relay position with this test relay. Then you take the test relay and you move it over to fan speed 2, which is the high speed one. And at this point, when you try to move the fan while holding the belt pulley, it should be locked. You should not feel any resistance. It should not move. Now, when you've passed those 2 things, it's time to air the system up and start the engine. Depending on your coach, you may or may not be able to air it up. So start the engine up. It'll air up, or it should air up. And with that test relay in position 1, it'll start to turn that fan. Once it starts turning, pull it out and then move it to position 2. This will prevent the fan clutch from getting a jolt from going from nothing to fan clutch 2. So in position 1 and in position 2, run this thing for some period of time to make sure that everything's working the way it's supposed to. And after you've run the coach, let's say 30 minutes in each position, then turn it off, check all your bolts, your air connections, your centering of the fan in the shroud, make sure everything is tight and you're ready to go. So that process was not too long. For somebody that knows what they're doing, they could probably do this in well under an hour. For a novice that's doing it, taking their time, you could probably do this in easily 3 hours. It's not a hard job. There is a little caution in there just because the radiator's there and you don't want to damage it, and it is a little heavy. What I showed you was doing this on a 12.7 liter engine where the charge air cooler sits on top of the radiator. On the 14 liter engines, they started pushing that fan clutch assembly further into the engine bay. So to get that one out, that's a reach. You'll definitely want to use some kind of ratchet strap or some other assembly to get that lifted up out of place and then brought towards you. And then there's a few converters that for a short period of time were putting one of their alternators on top of the support assembly above where the 90-degree gearbox is. For those, it may be extremely difficult to get that fan clutch out. It may require taking that alternator out of its place to do that. As you can see, it wasn't that difficult to change the fan clutch. If you got any value out of this video, please share and follow me on my YouTube channel. Until next time, drive safe, enjoy the journey.